our beds here in the past week to get ready for planting potatoes. And I want to first talk to you some about what I've prepped the beds with. So this dirt here, the base layer in this raised bed is a cow manure compost. I came behind that and I dumped a lot of rabbit manure, which is a cold manure, so it doesn't have to be composted. So that was fresh rabbit manure that I dumped over our base layer of cow manure compost. Then I came over that with about 2 cups of organic fertilizer. It's plant tone organic fertilizer, and I poured that over the top of that.
Carson.
Carson here. Carson. Don't come through my bed. So over the top of that, I put, for each one of these beds, which are 3 foot by 5.5 feet, I put a layer of peat moss over the top of all of that. So it ended up being about 1.5 cubics of peat moss that I put on top. Then I took just a little spade and I worked all of it in together really well so that there was a nice mixture of all of that. And it's nice and fluffy, which is really good for growing potatoes. They don't like compacted soil. And in our yard here, even if I were to till up an area to try to plant potatoes in the yard, our soil gets so wet and so compact that I really felt like putting the potatoes in the raised bed would be our best option to get a nice crop of potatoes. They just don't produce if the ground is too hard, and if it's too wet, they rot. So here's where we are today. I've gotten half of this bed done and another bed behind us. So what I did earlier this week, my seed potatoes came in, and what I have here is an Irish cobble potato. And in our area, because it gets hot,
Carson.
we're having some technical difficulties with Carson. Get out of the bed. He's trying to play. So we can only really grow the Irish potatoes. We can't grow russet style potatoes here. No, Carson, leave my cameraman alone.
Carson, go.
Show them what you're dealing with. He wants his bone. Go. Okay. So we can only do an Irish type potato here because it gets hot early in the season. Russet potatoes need a longer, cooler season, so we can't grow those here. So everything we grow is Irish style potatoes. This is a white Irish style potato. It's an Irish cobble potato. Now I actually have some more seed potatoes coming that are the red Vikings. I'm going to plant some Kennebec and some Yukon Gold as well. But this was my first batch that came in, and I wanted to go ahead and get those in the ground. Now when you get seed potatoes, you're going to want to cut those up and leave at least 2 or 3 good eyes on each piece that you cut. So you can see we have a couple of nice eyes coming in here, and there's another one there. And when you plant these, you're going to want to plant those eyes facing upward. Also, after you cut them up, give them 2 or 3 days to kind of seal over where you cut them so they dry out a little bit there. And that keeps them from rotting when you put them in the ground. If you just slice them and put them in the ground, they have a tendency to rot. So for planting these, you're going to want to go about 6 inches down in your soil. And this is nice and loose. Now the other thing that I'm doing as a precautionary today when I'm planting these, I have a mixture of this Revitalize, and this is a biological antifungal. It's organic, it's labeled for organic use, and I mixed a 1/2 tablespoon to a 1/2 gallon. So it's 1 tablespoon per gallon, but I did a 1/2 tablespoon because I mixed up a 1/2 gallon of this. And I just put it in my sprayer that I typically use. And what I'm gonna do is spray the ground when I put it in there, and then I'm just gonna spray the potato a little bit. And that just inoculates our potato with that biological fungicide that's going to kind of infuse the roots and hopefully help us not have to deal with as many fungal diseases with our potatoes. Potatoes can have a tendency to get early blight, so this is just a precautionary to hopefully give us less trouble later into the season. And these particular potatoes are ready to harvest at about 60 or 70 days. So they're a fast maturing potato, which is what we need in this area. Otherwise it gets too hot and they won't do well. Again, we've got good eyes here on the top. We're going to spray our ground, spray the potato, pop it in. It's about 6 inches down. If you go a little bit over, that's not so bad early in the season. One of the biggest things you really want to have done is have your soil prepped in advance so that when you get your seed potatoes, you're ready to go. It's can be a real ordeal to try to prep your soil and get them all planted in just a short period of time. So if you're ready ahead of time, it makes it really easy to get your potatoes in the ground. Again, nice eyes, seed side up, eye side up, and that's it. So we're going to go ahead and finish planting this bed. I've got enough space for 4 more. Potatoes actually don't mind being a little bit crowded as long as the soil is nice and loose where they can develop the tubers. Then they do okay with even a little bit of crowding. That's fine. Some wood in with our compost. It's kind of noisy out here this morning. Nate is on the tractor pushing up compost piles in the field where we have been feeding our cows hay throughout the winter, and they stand around the hay ring eating, producing a lot of poop, and then we have some leftover hay there on the ground area. So we push that up into piles and turn it, and that's where we get our cow manure compost. Okay, so we'll get the last of these potatoes planted. I think that's it with regard to getting potatoes in the ground. Okay, so we've got all of our potatoes in the ground. They're about 6 inches deep, and the last thing to do is to water them in. Now, potatoes don't like to be soaking wet, so if your ground is just saturated, they're going to rot. But they do need water, so just make sure your soil stays nice and moist but not soaking wet. Now, one of the things that I had talked to you about earlier in the video about the peat moss that we put in these boxes. Peat moss will hold water, so once you get it nice and wet, it's going to stay moist. But getting peat moss wet is more of a challenge because initially when you take it out of the bag, it's very dry, very fluffy, and it kind of resists soaking up the water. But once you get it nice and moist, it's going to hold the moisture without being overly wet on your potatoes. One other thing with regard to the peat moss that we put into these beds. Now, peat moss is an acidic component of your soil, but potatoes really like acidity. They can tolerate a lot of different soil types, but they like acidity. Now, our native soil here in the south is pretty acidic, but again, what we're using in these beds is compost. So the addition of the acidity in the peat moss is not going to be too much, and the potatoes should do really nice in that. And one final note on the type of potato that I planted today, the Irish cobbler potato. That is a high moisture potato once it's harvested. So it does really well for mashed potatoes and things like potato salad, but it's not a really good frying potato. So when you pick out your varieties, make sure you look at that because that's going to impact how you use the potatoes. And like I'd said before, I've ordered several other varieties. So I'll get a Kennebec and a Yukon Gold, and both of those will do better for a frying potato like French fries or something. So that's it for today's video. We'll come back as these potatoes grow and I'll show you their progress. We'll talk a little bit more about their nutrient requirements as they grow. So we'll talk about fertilizing them throughout their growing process. Like I told you earlier, we've gone ahead and put an organic fertilizer in with this mix, and we've used a lot of compost, including rabbit manure and cow manure. So this should be a good start for getting these potatoes started growing, but they will need some more nutrients throughout the growing process. And then there's also the process of healing the potatoes as they grow. So we'll come back and we'll do a video when we're going to heal our potatoes. Now, one of the things you'll see, I did not fill my beds completely to the top, and that's because I know that we're going to heal them, and instead of truly healing them up, I'm just going to add more layers of topsoil, compost, and organic matter to keep our potatoes covered and underground. So we will come back in probably about a month and talk more about these potatoes. Thanks for joining us today. If you enjoyed the video, please like it and consider subscribing to our channel.